Good evening. I want to thank Christopher for founding this Vermont Writers Series and the New England Review for sponsoring it. This is an institution of distinction, I think, in this area and beyond. And I want to thank especially John, who has created a space here which is a kind of intellectual center. I frequent it almost daily, and I appreciate what he's done here. I'm going to read two stories. The first one from a book of short stories that I'm developing. The first one is called A Lady. Fatigue, true fatigue, is a terrible thing. Harriet, at 85, suffered from this disease. She was no longer interested in politics, which had been one of her passions. She could not abide the family bar mitzvahs, and even the Passover seders were anathema to her. She had little appetite even for the marinated herring she used to love and the sponge cake from Entenmann's. No, Harriet was no longer interested in any of it. She wanted simply to be left alone, could stand no noise and confusion about her. It was as though her bodily cells were tired, could generate no energy. And so in desperation, and after much debate, she entered the famous rehabilitation center in Newton, where the emphasis, it turned out, was less on rehabilitation than it was on seeing the residents to a peaceful demise. Thus it came as a considerable shock to the family when it became apparent on visits to the center that Harriet had a boyfriend. She would sit on a bench in the corridor of the 4th floor of the Karmazine building of the center, holding hands with David, a smallish man of approximately her own age, a man with a cherubic smile on his face most of the time, but especially when he and Harriet were seated side by side. David wore an embroidered yarmulke, a skull cap, one made in Israel, given to him by his oldest son. David seemed to be a peaceful man, happy to be with Harriet, happy to be alive. The physical side of their relationship, it must be said, emphasized the hand-holding, but there was a strong hint of sexual flirtatiousness on both sides. And why not? They were both vital human beings, not dead yet. Harriet obviously relished her friendship with David, put on her prettiest dresses when she anticipated seeing him at lunch or dinner, and she also then applied a touch of lipstick and rouge. He too would dress for the occasion of seeing his dear friend. He would put on a fresh pair of pants, shave the stubble from his face, and comb his hair. They spent hours talking together of their earlier lives. David had been married 40 years when his wife Olga came down with incurable leukemia and died within 6 months, despite all the efforts of both the Beth Israel doctors and of David. Once Olga died, attended by David and their 2 sons, David's gradual decline began. The aches and pains of older age began to accumulate until he finally had a stroke and could not move his left side. That was 3 years earlier when it was decided to have him enter the rehab center, to which he readily agreed, no longer caring whether he lived or died. Harriet confided to David that she had long ago been married, had divorced after 15 years of wedded turmoil, and had an only daughter, Rachel, whom she adored. Rachel lived in Washington, D.C., where she worked for the Department of State. In addition to Rachel, Harriet had 2 younger brothers who were very attentive to her needs and visited her often. It was they in particular who found great pleasure in Harriet's friendship with David. The nursing staff at the center, however, was less than enthusiastic about the 2 lovebirds. The aides were told to keep them apart, as such fraternization among residents was not encouraged or even allowed. The head nurse, one Barbara Taylor on Karmazine 4, where both Harriet and David resided, was a Miss Ratched type, and she was utterly opposed to these overt displays of affection between the 2 residents. Furthermore, she had the rules of the rehab center with her on this. Harriet and David both had had to sign a statement on entering the rehab center that they understood and would abide by the rules, one of which banned fraternization between residents. Miss Taylor warned them from time to time to conduct themselves in a manner consonant with this rule, Article 3 of the bylaws. However, both David and Harriet found it impossible not to speak to one another each day, not to hold hands, not to occasionally give a peck on the cheek of the other. And so it came to pass that on a particularly lovely Monday morning, 1 June, when Miss Taylor, alias Ratchet, came in brimming with energy after the weekend away from her charges, she tugged at David's shirt and tried to pull him to a standing position while attempting physically to draw his right hand from Harriet's clutches. At first, the two residents were shocked at this physical contact with the witch of Karmazine 4. They did not get what she was trying to do, or see why she was trying to do it. They both resisted, with David's and Harriet's hands remaining tightly intertwined, and David's shirt starting to rip as Ratchet tugged fiercely at it. But finally, David understood, released his right hand, stood up straight as a rail, and punched Ratchet full in the face, causing blood to flow from her nose and eliciting shrieks from those who were witnessing the event. The other residents urged David on, but the RPNs, the registered practical nurses on the floor, came to her aid and called security. Two burly Jamaican orderlies appeared and hauled David off. Harriet was flustered, to say the least. She did not at all understand what the fuss was about. She had been calm and quietly seated on the bench next to her dear friend when suddenly chaos had ensued. The nurse got a bloody nose, and her friend was suddenly no longer there. All very discombobulating for a peace-loving soul. In fact, Harriet never saw David again. Unknown to her, he was reassigned to Karmazine 6, the floor for psychotic residents, or those with a violent streak. Harriet told her daughter Rachel of this situation one day when Rachel was visiting, and asked, quote, "Where is he? Is he in jail because of me?" Try as she would, Rachel could not remove this sense of guilt from Harriet's mind, and so after some 6 months, she asked one of the administrators what had become of David. The administrator said, "David became violent with our staff and had to be relocated to the 6th floor. He was sedated because of his agitation, and after a month on 6, he had another stroke and died. We were very sorry about this, as he had been a model resident until he became involved with your mother. Not her fault, of course, but we cannot have residents cavorting with one another. I'm sure you understand." Rachel could not bear to tell her mother of David's death, though she did explain that David had moved to 6, the significance of which eluded Harriet. Harriet did continue to ask if it were her fault that David had left. She could not make her peace with the situation. Harriet missed David deeply. She became very sad herself, and after developing cardiac failure, she too died some 9 months after the episode. This next story is an extract from a story that I call Fast Freddy. A different pace. As Freddy's income slipped from the teens into the teens from the 50 and 60K level, his sense of himself slipped too. He came eventually to view himself as a failure, having to take on an occasional dole from his hard-working but loving parents in order to make ends meet. This decline in his self-image caused Freddy to withdraw from all but his closest friends. For diversion from his non-existent personal life, Freddy played backgammon on the internet. It was his passion, no, his obsession. Internet backgammon was where Freddy, known on the internet as Fast Freddy, came alive. He had come to love the games. Freddie lost some games, won many more, but he knew it was only a game, so winning was not the point of the exercise for him. People's reactions online were what intrigued him. Freddie had noticed that internet backgammon players had a tendency, with little provocation, to sharing with him the most confidential of information about themselves. They would tell him about their spouses and boyfriends, their children, their jobs, their feelings about where they lived. Freddie, in his modesty, supposed they told these things to almost anyone with whom they played, but he was not sure of that, and probably they didn't. Truth is, Freddie felt he had a certain talent beyond backgammon. Freddie was genuinely interested in his opponents, where they were from, what their lives were like and how their lives seemed to them, what they were thinking about the latest U.S. incursion into country X. And so he asked them a few questions, simple questions, nothing loaded, but they responded in interesting ways. Fast Freddie's ability to elicit stories from players of all ages, from all countries, and from all stations in life was a gift. He came to see himself as a modern Don Quixote, riding through the countryside of contemporary human existence, meeting the downtrodden and the contented alike, helping them when he could with a few well-chosen words of encouragement, but mostly listening and recording in his mind the pages of their lives. Freddie was better to them than a psychiatrist because his clients didn't have to pay. They could get right to what was on their minds without a lot of dithering, and they didn't have to continue if they didn't want. A flick of the mouse, and they were back to normal. Freddie was especially fond of unusual or odd stories. He seemed to specialize in such stories. For example, he played a woman from the Middle West whose internet name was Mildred Pierce. So Freddie was already intrigued. She began the chat slowly enough, saying she lived in Wisconsin, was a baker, and so happened to be up very early in the morning or very late into the night when Freddie often was online playing backgammon. Mildred, as Freddie addressed her, had a husband who was chronically ill with emphysema, and Freddie was very sympathetic to Mildred and to her husband's plight. Freddie dared to ask how Mildred managed her personal life, which is an expression in code for her sex life, since he assumed that the emphysematous guy who had been a used car dealer had little interest in sex, focusing as he had to on each breath. Mildred insisted on telling Freddie a few details of which she was proud. John, her huffing and puffing hubby, understood the needs of his much younger and infinitely healthier wife, and Mildred told Freddie rather proudly that John had last year given her a special birthday present. He knew that Mildred had a fellow baker, an icer actually, at her firm, of whom she was very fond. So John arranged a hotel room for the night of Mildred's birthday and told her that it was his wish that she spend the night at the Comfort Inn just outside Madison with her icer colleague. Mildred and the icer did just as John suggested, and Mildred had what she described to Freddie as the best night of her life. We did it again and again in every position known to man. My wonderful husband John has promised me the same present again this year, but upgraded to the Holiday Inn. And so it went with Freddie, person after person, telling him his or her story, wanting Freddie's support, and being really grateful for his lack of judgment and his unconditional enthusiasm for the things they did or thought to do in the future. Little by little, Fast Freddie's reputation among his internet backgammon cognoscenti spread. His fellow players came to see that while Fast Freddie was one of them, he had an extraordinary degree of empathy in him and was always caring and faithful. Freddie's clientele was worldwide, confined to no one ethnic group. His beat, broadly speaking, was the planet Earth, and he gave his best reactions, honest reactions, to those with whom he communicated, because Freddie knew the modern world from personal experience, the world of cameras that no longer used film of portable phones that made everyone instantaneously available to everyone else. He understood the inhumanity of all this, and he went along with members of his army when they described to him how they felt isolated and alone in the world, feelings bottled up inside, unexpressed at home and at work. So Freddie gave and gave and gave some more to do his part to set the lives of his people in order, and they loved him for it. Gradually, from Istanbul to London to New York and Los Angeles, from Hawaii to China and on to India and Iran, people began to understand that they were not alone, that their Freddie was ever at the ready to help them, and they began to form networks, secure in the knowledge that they were enrolling in a fast Freddie movement that would soon sweep across the planet.